Greetings and welcome back to yet another episode of the Daily Run, and today we're playing as Judas. First things first, if for some reason my speech feels a little bit slurred or like I'm not making any sense, I feel like a part of my brain has just decided to stop working today, and it's exactly the part that actually takes care that I'm able to speak in long and proper sentences. I think I'm just tired from yesterday, or at least yesterday was a really long day for me, and I feel like I'm still feeling the side effects, but all of that right now is not important. I'm just throwing it out there as maybe a cautionary tale for what to expect throughout this video. But one thing I would like to talk about in this particular episode is one of the most, what I would say, underappreciated and underused aspects of Isaac, which I think really gives it its replayability. And in some sense, we know what this is, right? It's a bunch of items that actually synergize well together. It has a lot of weird, complex mechanics that kind of interact with each other in a way you wouldn't really expect. So every time you play through an Isaac run, it feels like it's something new, at least like for the first 700 hours. Then you kind of start picking up on things a little bit. But what I would really focus on here is that Isaac, I think more than any other game, or at least more than most games, gives you the opportunity to play the game in exactly the way you want it. And I know this seems like it's very silly, because obviously you can play the game in any way you want, because you are the player, you can control it. But what I'm trying to say here is that a lot of mechanics in Isaac kind of rely on the player to make active choices. So do you want to go to the item? Do you want to pick the item up? Do you want to ignore it? Do you maybe want to re-roll it? It's all very active choices that you're actually deciding as you're playing through the game. At least that's the way I play it. I don't know maybe if everyone perceives it the same way, but whenever I pick up a certain item, I think, okay, how does this work with every single other item I have? How can I utilize this to the best of its potential? Maybe I don't want to pick it up because it might anti-synergize with some of my other items that I already currently have on me. And one important part of this is that it allows you to kind of maximize the amount of fun you're having, or just focus on something else entirely. And I feel like because of that choice that you can choose, do you want the run to be fun, or do you want the run to be easy, or do you just want to have the highest score, is really what gives Isaac its, what I would say, objective. And not just that, it gives you more things to do as well. So for example, if you just want to do Eden runs, that can be really exciting as well, because of course whenever you start a new Eden run at the start, you're either going to be struggling or it's going to be a really easy time, but there's still that extra layer of challenge with starting with 2 random items that maybe you would never actually use otherwise. So because it gives you a lot of these, what I would say, partial goals, and you can actually decide how you want to play the game yourself. Like, for example, they want to have a fun run, and I might pick up Bob's Rain, but if I'm trying to go for the highest score, then I'm just going to ignore that item entirely, because obviously it's just going to do damage to me. And because you have this control over the things you do in-game, and because those options won't necessarily hurt you, they're not, what I would say, like picking up Bob's Brain at the start or not, is not a choice that will hurt the majority of the runs. Now, it might hurt some runs, so it's still a very conscious choice that you have to make, but picking it up is usually not going to have an effect of just ruining the whole run entirely. I think you can compare this to a lot of other games. Like, for example, Dark Souls, I feel like to a certain extent also allows you to do this, but at the same time, not really, right? Like, for example, in Dark Souls, if you don't know what it is, it's like an RPG game in some sorts. You have weapons and you fight monsters and bosses and things like that. It's a very typical game in those senses. But one thing that it kind of has to do is you have to pick a weapon that's kind of tailored to, for example, how much strength you have. And when you have that weapon, and as you're progressing throughout the rest of the game, you kind of have no choice but to upgrade it. Now, you might say, well, you don't have to upgrade it, and that way you're going to have a bigger challenge. And I would agree to a certain extent, but the problem is that the game wasn't designed with that in mind, whereas Isaac was definitely designed with that in mind, at least from my perspective, or at least the way I see it. Because the choices in Isaac tend to be, I would say, less punished, or at least less punishable if something tends to go wrong. Whereas in Dark Souls, for example, not upgrading your weapon can be the difference between killing the boss in like 3 minutes and taking 30 minutes to do it. And that's obviously a very, what I would say, high difference. So I guess what I'm trying to say, that choices in Isaac feel less meaningful, and that's exactly what gives its replayability in some sense. And it's something that I don't think gets mentioned often. Maybe I'm just kind of paraphrasing, and maybe I'm just leaving out some important plot details, but if you're kind of trying to compare it to Dark Souls in some sense, what I think you can do in Dark Souls that kind of correlates to what I'm trying to say here is, for example, you can pick a different run. Now, maybe using a +1 weapon and +2 weapon aren't really choices you can make in the game. I think this is something that's kind of forced on you if you actually want to go throughout the game and not die miserably. You can pick a different weapon, for example. You can maybe try a different weapon that has a different moveset. And some movesets might be better against some bosses, and they might be harder against some other bosses. You might try ranged weapons, or magic, or bows, for example. And all of those, I think, add that extra layer of challenge on top of it. Now, in Dark Souls, I think it's actually still a pretty good example of a game where it allows you to do the choices that you want to do in order to make the game as difficult or as easy or as fun as you possibly want, because what you can do is essentially you can equip a really heavy burly armor and just double wield 2 giant hammers and just go ham on the enemies, and in a certain extent that's fun, and you can do that inside what I would say the world that it creates. And of course you can be extra hyper competitive and just really use the best kind of weapons, the best kind of rings, and kind of go from that. Now, why I think this is so important in creating replayable games and games that will kind of remain fun for the rest of eternity, essentially, is because at a certain point you kind of take everything that the game has to offer to you, and the only way to really start progressing or just having more fun with the game is to give you some extra level of challenges that hadn't existed before. And the only way that you can really do that at a certain point is by essentially posing them on yourself. So for example, I might go to an Isaac run and say, this time I want to get as high of a streak as possible. And because I'm trying to get as high of a streak as possible, I will play the game inherently differently as I would play it if I was just trying to win, for example, or if I was trying to get the highest score. And all of those little nuances, I think, really add to the depth and the complexity of the game, and really kind of show you just how much you can replay it before it starts to get boring. Now, certain other games, like for example, like single-player narrative adventures, now obviously those games have their place in life, but the problem with them is that they're not replayable in some sense, because what ends up happening, of course, once you've experienced the story, there's nothing else that you can do, and those games typically tend to be on the easier side as well, which means you really can't self-impose challenges. Like for example, if you take something like Arkham Asylum, now I guess what you can do is I say I will play throughout the game without using combat, for example. I won't fight enemies, I'll just use my gadgets. Well, in certain cases that's actually impossible to do because the game is kind of programmed that way, so there's really a lot of limitations as to what you can and can't do. Now, I'm not saying that you can't self-impose challenges in those kinds of games at all, but it's definitely much harder, and those self-imposed challenges feel like you're kind of actively fighting against the game, and I think that's what really hurts it in the long run. Now, I'm not saying that it's a worse game because of that, or it's a better game, it's just a different type of game, and I think Isaac is so replayable precisely because of this reason, because it gives you something to kind of go on, and it keeps you kind of wanting for more. And whenever I feel like I'm having a bad run, or maybe I'm just feeling a little bit silly, like in this particular one, I'm gonna take Bob's brain, I'm gonna reroll my entire run, I'm gonna go through the void and, play with Marked or whatever. And to a certain extent, that's what gives it its novelty, because I tend to try hard in a lot of these dailies, and sometimes I tend to have a little bit of fun. And there's room for both in this game. It never feels like you're really punished for it. Sure, you're gonna take more damage, but it's kind of to be expected, you know what you're signing up for. But at the same time, even if you do take more damage, it's just gonna end up in reducing your points by a little bit, like maybe 2,000 in the total scheme of things. It's not usually gonna punish you in the way that, for example, it would just end your run, and that would be that. So with all of that said, and all of that combined, I do really appreciate Isaac for its design decisions, at least in this department, because it really feels like that's what makes Isaac so interesting to me, because I can always kind of go back and decide on how I want to play the game, how can I optimize it, how can I maybe change my playstyle to make it a little bit more enjoyable or a little bit more competitive, and it just gives you all of these extra layers of depth that I feel like I can just keep building upon, and it's really why this game never gets any less fun. With all of that said, this was kind of in the theme of this daily, because I actually picked up so many different items that really didn't work well together, like Bob's brain. I rerolled my run, and there was the War Familiar, which spawns explosive flies, and it's kind of silly because he damages you so often, but at a certain point you're just like, okay, so apparently this is going to be a run where damage penalty is going to be relatively high, we might just as well have fun with it, and that's exactly what I did. Now, in the end case, even though I took so much damage, I still ended up ranking in a really, really good spot. So, like I said before, if you play the game well and if you know what you're kind of doing fun things is not necessarily gonna punish you. Sure, you might not be first in the overall grand scheme of things, and if you want to do that, then probably try to have less fun. But even if you have fun, you can still end up with really good scores, with really good ranks, and I feel like that's just a really great thing to have in a game like this. With all of that said, I hope you enjoyed this one, guys, and I hope to see you next time.